My number one goal is for the recall to be successful. And that's why this is different than an ordinary election. There are two questions on the ballot. The first of which is, do you want to remove Gavin Newsom from office? And none of us on the second question will be the new governor unless that first question succeeds. And so I do not think it's productive to draw contrasts with other replacement candidates. My focus is entirely on drawing contrasts with Gavin Newsom. And as far as your question, well, how do voters then differentiate you from the other candidates? Well, I think that, it's whoever manages to draw that contrast best, whoever shows that they would sort of do the opposite of what Gavin Newsom has done and would be prepared to get the state on a new course, from day one in the most effective way. I think that's the person that, voters will ultimately choose to institute the fundamental call for change that a recall will represent. And I've been in the legislature for 5 years, as we've been talking about. I know exactly how corrupt our state capitol is. I know exactly how broken our state government is. And I think I'd be prepared on the first day in office to begin to do that, to translate, to answer the call for change that the recall represents with real, meaningful, major, tangible reforms at the Capitol and a new direction for the state, so that by the time 2022 comes around, voters will have a very clear choice. Do we want to continue on this new path, or do we want to go back to the way things were?
Welcome, Mr. Kiley. Can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for taking the time.
You bet. How's it going?
Good. Did you have a late night at the debate?
It wasn't too bad. It was actually just an hour, so we're kind of, went by quick.
Yeah, good. Well, we'll try and keep this. We got a lot of ground we want to cover here today, so we're going to move kind of as quickly as we can, and this is being recorded to be posted to our voter guide in full. So for those of you who are watching, Kevin Kiley was elected to the state assembly from the Sacramento area in 2016. He's a lawyer who previously worked in the Attorney General's office, and he's a Republican candidate in the recall election on September 14th. So thank you for joining us. I'm David Lesher. I'm the editor here at CalMatters, and I will serve as our host for the discussion today. We also have a panel of reporters and editors who are going to pepper you with a bunch of questions. So all the major issues facing California today that we can get to. So I want to do a quick round of introductions, and if our folks, if you want to just wave when I say your name. With us today, Vicky Haddock is our managing editor. Foon Rhee is our political editor. Ben Christopher is our political reporter. Emily Hoban, is our newsletter writer. Rachel Becker is our environment reporter. Anna Ibarra is our health reporter. Joe Hong is our education reporter. Veranda Lyons is our justice reporter. And Manuela Tobias, just back from vacation, is our housing reporter. So obviously we have a lot to cover here. I'm going to act as kind of the host and step in at times to maybe move us along, but I'll turn it over right away to Ben Christopher and Emily.
Hey, Assemblymember, thanks so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it. So before we get into the sort of the gritty policy questions, I just wanted to get into the politics. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you that if you were to become governor, you would be presiding over a legislature that's supermajority Democratic. And so I wonder if you can just talk through your thinking in terms of how you would actually get anything done in that environment, whether you would pursue a strategy of negotiating with your current coworkers in the legislature, or whether you would sort of pursue more of an executive order based strategy of actually getting policy done.
Well, I mean, it'd be both. I would use executive orders, not really in the way that this governor has, which is kind of to create his own set of policies, but rather to roll back a lot of policies that I think are harmful and have made life more difficult for people here. And so I think that's one of the major opportunities you have as governor is just your leadership of the executive branch, where a lot of the power is vested, where the legislature has delegated a lot of power to state agencies. But, I would want to start working with the legislature immediately, because it's such a truncated term. You have a year before the next election. And so one of the things I've talked about is calling a special session to institute what I would call the call for change that the recall represents, if it's successful. So the legislature would come back, I guess it'd be sometime in the late fall, early winter, for maybe multiple special sessions, because there is a subject matter limitation with respect to any particular session. But I've spent 5 years in the legislature. I know how the process works. I know where the power resides. I know what the veto gates are. I know the ways that legislators try to stop good legislation while avoiding accountability. I know the way that the tricks that are used to change bills into something that they weren't before. I know the way that bad things get through, often without the level of scrutiny that they merit. And so I would take that vantage point and have that in mind as I tried to advance a package of reforms on key issues like education reform, housing, certainly the cost of living, homelessness, crime. And I think that the kind of new element, in addition to just simply having a different person in the governor's office who's actually there to govern in the public interest, rather than to serve the third house lobbyists that control the legislature as well, is the political pressure that will be created by a successful recall. I mean, the one thing that legislators are wary of is losing their job in the next election. And if they've just seen that even the governor has lost his job, then I think that'll create an entirely new environment with another election coming up in 2022. And so, if the legislature says that we're just going to, we're not going to do anything, we're going to let the state continue to deteriorate, we're going to let the, housing costs continue to go up, we're going to let homelessness continue to spread, we're going to, see more and more people continue to leave the state, we're going to let our public schools continue to fail, then, that'll set the stage, I think, for what could be a wave election in 2022 to have a major personnel change in the legislature as well. So I'm hoping that, if they glimpse that possibility, that'll provide a real incentive to work in a cooperative manner.
Great. Well, thanks for that. So there's a lot there. So looking at the first part of your answer, which was talking about using executive power not to advance policies necessarily, but to sort of roll things back. You've obviously been very critical of this governor for his, what you would call like excessive use of executive authority, both rhetorically, but also in the courts. And I wonder, can you explain why that's not inconsistent, given your criticism of this governor, to then turn around and use executive power to
well, the distinction that I just drew is I would not use executive authority to create new laws and new policies as this governor has, but I would use it to unwind, things that never should have been there to begin with. So, if we want to look at things specifically related to COVID-19, you could terminate the state of emergency. That's something that can be done immediately on day one by the governor, and that's in the Emergency Services Act, and that has the effect of automatically terminating related state and local emergency orders as well. Or if you want to pick just, other legally, let's say, questionable executive orders this governor has done, like the one to phase out gas-powered vehicles, or the one to ban fracking, which Newsom himself said wasn't legal less than a year ago. Those are things that, could immediately be undone. And that would not be, an act of overreaching, executive power. It'd be quite the contrary. It would be nullifying an act of overreaching executive power. And so that would be more or less my framework.
Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to clarify that you're talking about using executive order to unwind this governor's executive orders, not necessarily unwinding additional legislation that you find objectionable.
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of policy that's made through the executive branch via the regulatory process. Whether you look at CARB or the Water Board or the Department of Public Health, and it is the domain of the executive branch to create regulations on the basis of duly delegated authority. And so that certainly is a way in which, and in my view, I think that authority has been exercised far too aggressively by a lot of our state agencies in order to, entangle themselves too deeply in the lives of Californians. And so that would be, much the same as what I was saying with respect to the governor's executive orders, that where I think that the executive branch has taken power that's been delegated to it, but has used it far too aggressively, then I would seek to rein that in.
Okay. And then you also mentioned that you do know where the levers of power in the legislature are, the bodies are buried. And so you could actually try and foster some sort of bipartisan compromise. Are there particular policy areas where, just given the political reality, realistically, you think you could actually find bipartisan solutions or compromise on these issues?
Yeah, I do. And, when I first got to the legislature in 2016, I made a point of meeting with every single member of the legislature, both sides of the aisle, to find areas of common ground. And so, for example, Bill Quirk and I ended up working together on bills to advance freedom of speech on college campuses. And so, I know kind of the profile of every legislator and where we could find common ground. And I've always been of the view that if you can find 10% of agreement, then let's look at the cup as 10% full, not 90% empty. I think
what's in that 10% though, specifically?
What's that?
Like what's in that 10%? What are
well, obviously it depends upon different legislators. I mean, you have to build a different coalition around different issues. Like on education reform, obviously the war on charter schools and the war on equity and so forth. That's led by the CTA, and it's just become sort of open season since they got their man in the governor's seat. That has continued to pace, although there have been some legislators on the Democrat side who are at least have some understanding of the harm this is doing and have been willing to vote against the very worst bills. And I think that, education is one of the key drivers of this recall. The governor decided to shut down schools longer than any state in the country while his own kids were in-person private schools. So clearly he didn't think that was the safe thing to do, but he thought it was the thing that served his political interests. So parents have been living with their kids at home for no good reason at all, just like many were living with their kids going to failing schools. And the cause is the same in both cases, that we have a special interest in this state that controls this governor whose business model is keeping kids trapped in failing schools. And so I think that, the recall, if it is successful on the basis largely of the frustration of parents with the failures of our education system, then that will provide the added impetus to take, the coalition that was already there, but not quite strong enough to advance good legislation and to take it to the next level. And I think that you can, look at that over a whole host of areas. I mean, certainly with respect to the drought and wildfires, which are again at peak levels and are causing so much harm. I would hope that that's an area where we could, build consensus as well. I mean, that's one of the themes of my campaign is we just need to get back to basics as a government. We're doing a lot of things we shouldn't be doing, and yet we're not doing the basic things that people rely on in order to protect their communities.
Okay. I think I'm out of time here, so I will pass along.
Thanks, Ben. And next up, we'll talk to Rachel Becker, our environment reporter.
Hey, thanks for joining us.
Rachel, before you start, Mr. Kiley, can you lift your screen up so your head is not cut off at the top? Yes.
Okay, there you go. Sorry.
Right, looking less decapitated.
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us today. As Dave said, I'm an environment reporter at CalMatters, and we know that environmental issues are really at the forefront of people's minds right now. You mentioned drought, wildfires, and we know the science says that climate change is worsening wildfires, raising temperatures, increasing the risk of extreme drought. So how much of a threat do you think climate change poses to California, and how will you prioritize it if you take office?
Well, I think that, the expert consensus is that it's certainly a factor on both of those things, but it's definitely not the primary factor. I mean, we've been having droughts for forever. I mean, I think that for the first 11 years of California's statehood, from 1850 to 1861, we were in a drought. There's no doubt that it's been a contributing factor in these recent fires in particular, reaching new levels. But it is I think beyond dispute that the primary cause is something different, and that goes, by the way, for both droughts and wildfires. Which is just incompetent government performance. We haven't had the level of forest management that any halfway any government with half its wits about it would have engaged in, seeing how clear the link is between poorly managed forests and the risk of wildfires.
I do have to push back a little bit that anthropogenic climate change is a significant contributor to increasing teal dryness and escalating burned area, and that's pretty clear in recent studies. Other recent studies also say that climate change is increasing the risk of extreme drought in California. The climate change is a major factor. As one UC Merced scientist said, climate change is kind of the one ring to rule them all when it comes to wildfires.
Right. So, I mean, I don't know that we're saying anything that's all that different from each other. The reality is, if you look at the Creek Fire last year, for example, which ravaged huge parts of Madera and Fresno counties. I think it was the fourth largest wildfire in state history at the time. The forest around Shaver Lake was spared. And it wasn't because climate change was somehow less of a factor there. It was because that forest had been properly managed. I think it was actually the utility that's in charge of it there, Edison. But for a long time, they've been engaging in the strategic removal of the most aged trees. They've been doing prescribed burns. And as a result, there wasn't the level of fuel and undergrowth that has served to create these catastrophic events with the frightening regularity that we now have. So we can talk about climate change all day, and you'll find room for reasonable disagreement about exactly how much of a factor that is in all of this. But it's certainly not something that we're going to solve overnight, and especially not with anything we do in California, where we have 1% of global emissions. What we can solve very quickly is what is I believe most people agree the far more significant factor, which is the condition of our forests. And so that it means actually prioritizing projects that need to be prioritized rather than just talking about them as the governor has. I would say we should be using a lot more of the cap and trade funds, for example, on forest management. I think CAL FIRE has a backlog of 500 projects for prescribed burns that they'd like to do. And we really need to clear out the regulatory barriers to things like timber harvest plans, where you need to get 4 different approvals. On average, I believe it takes 4 years and 800 pages of analysis just to get a timber harvest plan approved, which the LAO has called cost prohibitive in most cases. It's similar with prescribed burns. I think you usually need to get 3 different permits just to do that. And so when you look at what's happened to the amount of wood actually being taken out of the forest, I believe in 1990, there were 5 billion board feet of timber removed from forests on an annual basis. By the end of that decade, it was down to 2 billion. It's 1.5 billion today. So the logging industry has absolutely been decimated. And, and the result is we have 15 to 20 million acres of overgrown forests in California right now. And there's, of course, a whole host of other issues connected there, like our aging utility infrastructure and the role of PG&E in all of this, which, of course, the governor has been uniquely intertwined and with PG&E in the way he's governed. But let me just briefly touch on drought. Because the governor's agriculture secretary recently blamed Mother Nature and climate change for the draconian cutbacks that were issued by the Water Board. I'd point you to Adam Gray's letter to the Water Board opposing these cutbacks as unnecessary and serving special interests. Adam Gray is, of course, a Democrat Assembly member. But when I saw the governor's agriculture secretary say that this is Mother Nature and climate change that we have to blame, I mean, my reaction is actually the whole reason we have government is to solve the problems that nature throws our way.
So what's number 1 on your priority list when it comes to drought and wildfires then?
Well, when it comes to, I mean, there are different issues, but when it comes to drought, obviously it's expanding our capacity, our storage capacity, or other, elements of the water supply. I have a constitutional amendment that we've been working on that would allocate 2% of the general fund every year towards projects to increase the water supply. That includes, it's kind of all of the above. It's conveyance, it's aquifers, it's reservoirs, it's dams, it's potable reuse, it's desalination. It's also investment in new technologies. It would cap administrative fees at 5%. It would require the agencies to actually use the money for that purpose, so we don't relive Prop 1 all over again. And it would provide protection against litigation and liability. And that would remain in place, 2% of the general fund every year, until we add 5 million acre feet to the annual water supply. There's absolutely no reason that we should have water shortages in California. It is a political choice based upon our failure to actually, save water and build the capacity to do so. And then, with fires, it's just the things that I just listed in terms of prioritizing forest management, removing the regulatory barriers to doing so, as well as, bringing some accountability and upgrades to our utilities. And then maybe a final thing I'd mention is actually supporting local fire departments, which when we do increase funding, usually don't get any of it. And they're the first line of defense.
You mentioned to Ben that you plan to unwind the executive orders that phase out the sale of new gas-powered cars in the state over the next 15 years, and the mandate to stop approving new oil fracking by 2024. But California's climate regulators have said that there need to be much bigger cuts in climate warming pollution in order to reach the statutory goal of reducing greenhouse gases 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. So what do you do what do you intend to do to tackle fossil fuel emissions in California?
Well, I'd say first, I would undo those executive orders for the primary reason that I don't think they were properly issued in the first place. On both of those issues, the legislature had actually been considering similar policies. They failed in the legislature. And so the governor had actually said that he needed legislation in order to do the fracking ban, but it didn't pass the legislature. And then he decided he wanted a good headline. So he just oh, okay, I'll do an executive order. So I think that, whatever your views as to the substance of those orders, they were not properly issued and should be rolled back for that reason alone. I guess the premise of your question assumes that those goals ought to remain in place, which I think is certainly up for debate. I mean, California has so poorly managed the transition to the future of clean energy, which is very much the future. But we've done so in a way that, number one, has made energy more expensive here than any other state. I believe maybe we're tied with Connecticut in terms of the cost per kilowatt hour, but it's twice as expensive as many other states. That's a big factor, by the way, of the highest in the nation poverty rate we have here. A lot of Californians live in energy poverty, which is the term for what I think it's like 10% or something of your income is spent on energy or something along those lines. So that's something that we need to be a lot more attentive to. But when it comes to actually moving towards renewables, the fact is that solar is being adopted more rapidly, not because of anything California policymakers have done. It's because of the declining cost curves across the globe. That's what you're seeing. And that's a product of innovation. It's not a product of, the kind of ham-handed state policies we had here in California. So we should be doing everything we can to encourage innovation, which will bring down those cost curves and will allow for the more rapid adoption of renewables. But it needs to be an all of the above approach rather than the kind of arbitrary picking of winners and losers that we've had in California, where while solar and wind are the winners, but hydro for some reason doesn't count. Nuclear doesn't count, even though it's emissions free, and we're now closing Diablo Canyon. And any future technologies that don't yet exist, they don't count either. We're going to lock ourselves into just the ones that exist in the here and now. And so I think that California has managed to kind of undermine the goal of a clean energy future, while at the same time making life more difficult in the present.
I think that's the time we have. So thank you for speaking with me about this.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And now we're going to talk with Ana Ibarra, who is our health reporter.
Assemblymember Kiley, thanks for doing this. So I do have some questions about vaccines and the pandemic, but I'd like to start with healthcare access and affordability. I think we've heard less about this from candidates. So, affordability, healthcare access continue to be top concerns for many Californians. This year, Governor Newsom expanded Medi-Cal access to more undocumented immigrants. He also has a committee of experts exploring how the state can get closer to universal coverage. Meanwhile, your Democratic colleagues have a single payer bill that will come up for consideration again next year. What are your thoughts on these efforts? And is coverage expansion and affordability something that is on your priority list? Is that something that your administration would take on? And if so, what do you think can realistically get done in a year?
Well, I mean, my goal is yes, expanding access to health coverage that makes a difference for people. The thing about Medi-Cal is there's not a lot of evidence that actually helps people. I mean, we have over a third of our state that's on Medi-Cal, and the cost has it's well over doubled just since the expansion under the Affordable Care Act. It's by far the largest cost driver in our state budget. And yet, where's the evidence that it's actually like improved the health of people across California? I haven't seen that. And in fact, when you've done studies, I think there was actually one in Oregon, so this isn't specific to California, but they did a study that kind of controlled for all the relevant variables to look at whether having coverage having Medicaid coverage improved health outcomes versus not having it. And there was no difference. In fact, I think the people who had it did a little worse than the people who didn't have it. And so saying we're going to expand coverage and just kind of, citing numbers about the percentage of people who are covered and so forth, that is, a nice talking point for politicians. But when it comes to the quality of people's lives, it doesn't necessarily make a difference. And so I've kind of advocated for, trying to think about healthcare in a way that is more outcome oriented. And I think a lot of that comes down to preventative care, having the right incentives in place there, and putting more power kind of in the hands of the healthcare consumer in order to, have different options. And that's, I think, a big part of driving down costs as well.
So is it, would it be fair to assume that, issues like, or proposals like single payer would not stand a chance under your administration?
Yeah, I don't favor single payer. Yeah, that's right.
So let's get to vaccines. We know that vaccines are the best tool we have to protect ourselves and others against the virus. You shared that you're vaccinated, but you're also opposed to vaccine mandates. So if not by mandates, what do you think should be done that hasn't been done yet to increase vaccinations in the state?
Well, I mean, California is, not, I don't think our rates are particularly great. I mean, in terms of maybe what you might expect, given that we've had the harshest, mandates, we've had the biggest lotteries, right? And, our rates are fairly middling. And so clearly the governor's approach has not been a huge success. And I actually would have done things completely differently from him every step of the way. For one thing, I would not have cast doubt on the safety of the vaccine in order to try to score political points. Last October, he came out and said, we cannot take the FDA's word for whether the vaccine is safe. And I'd encourage you to read the letter from the chair of the US Senate Health Committee, what's his name, senator in Tennessee, which said that Newsom was attacking the career scientists at the FDA. And he said, quote, that he was discouraging Americans from taking the vaccine and was costing lives. So, Newsom thought that this was good politics for him at the time to attack the vaccine, to cast doubt on it. And so that's what he did. And then, when it came time to the rollout, he did not initially prioritize seniors. He did not have the legislature in session to help with the rollout as I had requested. And in January, for a time, we were 50th out of 50 in terms of getting our allotted doses administered. And this was, when it mattered most of all. This was when COVID deaths were at their peak. We had hundreds of people dying every day. And the governor didn't prioritize seniors. And then when he did make them eligible, it was just a complete mess. You had people who were trying all day to get their appointment, couldn't get their appointment. You had doses that were being thrown out. A member of the governor's own vaccine advisory committee said that his worst nightmare was coming true. And so think of how many lives we would have saved if we had just done a better job then getting vaccines to people who actually wanted them. And so that would have been my approach, is the majority of people want the vaccine, and I would have done everything in my power to get them the vaccine as quickly as possible. I would have also recognized that there's a small minority of people that oppose medical procedures of different kinds, not just vaccines, but blood transfusions, organ transplants. Some people are opposed to medical interventions of any kind. And I would have provided every assurance to them from the beginning that your rights will not be violated, that your beliefs, your bodily autonomy will be respected. I think that's vitally important. Number one, because it's just the value, a value that we hold as a country, is that we're protective of minority rights. But number two, it sends a very important signal to the much larger group of people who don't, in principle, object to vaccination, but for one reason or another have their doubts about this one. And I think that for that group, if they see, like they're seeing now, that the coercive powers of government are being brought to bear in order to violate people's deeply held beliefs, that engenders distrust. And when you look at the reasons people are not getting it, one of the major reasons cited is distrust of government. And so I would have done everything I could to get the vaccine to the people who want it, the vast majority or to the majority who want it, to respect the rights of the small minority that object to it in principle, and to build trust and provide information and access to everyone else.
So what do you think can be done now to increase vaccinations, maybe among that group of people who might still not either have access or might be basing their decision on misinformation? Like, do you have any specific ideas of how we can increase vaccination among that group?
Yeah, I mean, it's what I just said. I would roll back the mandates that this governor has imposed, and I would make it very clear that this is not something that is going to be forced upon anyone. And I would try to build the trust that, try to repair the trust that this governor has undermined.
So what happens if you become governor and then this fall we start to see cases and hospital admissions start to rise at a concerning rate, like we did last fall and winter? Can you walk us through like what that response would look like this fall or winter if we were to see that again?
Well, I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, we're obviously going through a unfortunate spike with the Delta variant, although this most recent week, the growth in cases nationwide is down. So hopefully we're starting to turn the corner, although that's by no means assured. But what I would do is I would take a diametrically different approach than Gavin Newsom has. From the very beginning, he has imposed the most stringent level of government control. And so it's not just a debate of, well, are you someone who thinks lockdowns was a good idea? Are you someone who thinks school closures was a good idea? To defend Newsom, it's a much higher burden. You have to show why it was a good idea to have to be 50th out of 50 in terms of what was allowed to be open, to be 50th out of 50 in terms of getting all of our kids back to school. Did every other state get it wrong? And so you'd think that, if this was really the way to go about it, well, gosh, we had the harshest lockdowns. We had the longest school closures. We've had the most stringent mask policies. Surely we must be doing the best when it comes to public health, but the evidence is quite the contrary. Our COVID mortality rates are pretty much middle of the pack. And then when you take the measure of death from all causes, which is much more meaningful, then we've seen a much bigger spike than elsewhere in the country. We'd have thousands more people alive today if we were just on the national average by that measure. So the evidence suggests that the governor's approach has been a failure, a catastrophic failure. That states that took a more balanced approach, that provided citizens the information they needed to protect themselves, trusted them to make their own decisions, did a lot better in terms of keeping their economy going, keeping their kids in school, and avoiding the just absolutely devastating consequences of our own school closures, as well as overall public health outcomes have been better there as well.
Okay. Well, thank you, Anna. And now I want to turn to education, a little topic like that. And Joe Hong is our education reporter.
All right.
Thanks for being with us, Member Kiley. So you've expressed your support for school vouchers, whether that money goes to public schools or private schools. I want to ask you, why is this type of systemic change the most effective way to close the achievement gap along both racial and socioeconomic lines?
Well, I don't use the term vouchers. I prefer to think of it in terms of, empowering parents to take the education dollars that are allotted to their child and using them as they see fit. And, in California, we have been, narrowing the opportunities and the options for parents every year. And that's, of course, picked up considerable steam since Gavin Newsom came into office. And, his top priority was simply to reward his top campaign donor, the California Teachers Association, that wants to eliminate those options as much as possible. So, I've been a big supporter of charter schools, which essentially adhere to that principle, and all within the framework of the public education system, that you are not tied to the neighborhood school that is assigned to you by virtue of your zip code, but rather you can go and enroll at tuition free at another school that doesn't get any students assigned to it, but has to come up with a good offering that causes people to opt in. And we've had a pretty good record of success with charters across California, but unfortunately, they're trying to go after charters now, and there's been various strategies to undermine the whole idea of chartering. And so what you've seen in response to the COVID era is across the country, you're actually seeing a revolution in school choice, because kind of the corruption of the education establishment has been so spectacularly demonstrated to parents who are forced to grapple with distance learning, often for no good reason at all. And so California, though, is not responding to this. There's been a further sort of retrenchment. I mean, disgracefully, there was a trailer bill passed just a couple months into the COVID era to cut off funding for growing schools. That was specifically meant to stop people from disenrolling from their closed neighborhood school and enrolling in, say, an independent study-based charter that already had a well-developed model for distance learning. That was the whole point of that bill that Gavin Newsom signed. And by the way, it triggered a lawsuit that was called the most important education civil rights lawsuit since Brown v. Board of Education. And so I'm turning to an initiative that would, put power more directly in the hands of parents, because we've seen that the education establishment in California is unwilling to serve students. And so I think we need a paradigmatic shift. And I think that will provide an added form of leverage on the part of the legislature, with that initiative waiting in the wings to actually enact meaningful legislation, education reform, after I take office.
Just to clarify, if you were elected, you would allow public money to follow the student to private schools as well?
Well, that's what the initiative does. Yes, absolutely. And, I'd want to work with the legislature to expand school choice in any way that I could. I mean, I think that, if we could arrive at actually reviving the charter sector and, having, removing all these arbitrary barriers that put in place, making it easier for good charters to grow and multiply, then that'd be a substantial step forward. And maybe that sort of thing wouldn't be needed, but there's been no willingness on the part of the legislature or the governor of the education establishment to do anything like that. And so that's what's made me think that we just need to completely change the way the whole system works.
So in light of the spread of the Delta variant, what role do you think the state or the governor's office should play in ensuring safe school reopenings this fall? Should masking and vaccines be required for all eligible staff and students?
No, and I think that the idea of, I don't even say safe school reopenings, because pretty much any form of a reopening is safer than the alternative, which is keeping kids at home. I mean, we know that the harms are just absolutely enormous. And even the Journal of the American Medical Association showed that we're reducing life expectancy for kids by millions of years collectively. Gavin Newsom knows that having kids out of school is more dangerous than having them in school. That's why he sent his own kids to in-person private school. So that being said, of course, we should take whatever measures are necessary to make school as safe as possible. I have many districts in my area that have been doing just that just since last fall, who have managed to sort of avoid all of the barriers that this governor has thrown in their path, and have kept schools open, have done a good job educating kids, and know there haven't been massive outbreaks or anything like that. But the mask issue is one that is I think very important, because we're learning more about some of how that cost benefit analysis plays out. And when you look at countries like the United Kingdom that has said, no, we're not going to do masks in elementary schools because the harm to a child's development outweighs the rather uncertain benefits of masking. I mean, the studies on this have been kind of inconclusive. I think that this is an issue that should be in the hands of parents. It should not be ordered by the governor for millions of kids in California.
So who would you appoint to the State Board of Education?
You want names?
If you have them.
I don't have names, but I would appoint people who care about kids. That is, it's never about the kids when it comes to education policy in California. And so I'd appoint people who would change that.
And how do you think that approach differs from who Governor Newsom chose for his board?
Well, I mean, Linda Darling Hammond is the president, who's, we know that she's been on the wrong side of all of these issues. I mean, she was behind this bill to try to ban Teach for America in California that Christina Garcia introduced. She has been in the board. She's been someone who has been completely, I think, in lockstep with Newsom and CTA, and has seen education as and kids as just a vehicle for funneling money to special interests who then funnel it back to politicians. And I would change that approach. We have an education system in order to educate kids, and every child in California under our Constitution has a right to a high quality education. Yet here, even before COVID-19, we were failing to fulfill that, in any way. We were 49th out of 50. I think your publication had an article on this in 2019 as to how California was 49th out of 50 when it came to education outcomes in low-income communities, with only Alaska being worse. And, there's absolutely no reason that should be the case, and didn't used to be the case. But our, public school system has been taken over by special interests that don't serve kids, and we need to change that.
Great, thank you.
Good. Thank you, Joe. And next is our justice reporter, Veranda Lyons.
Hi, Mr. Kiley. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm well. I have a few questions. One, I'm not seeing you. Hold on. Okay, now I can see you. All right. One, you voted last year. There was the big uprising to this around justice issues and in particular biases. You voted against allowing counties to establish sheriff oversight boards and against repealing some judicial fees, and also against prohibiting the state from seeking criminal convictions on the basis of race. Where do you stand on criminal justice reform? And is that something you consider to be a big issue in California? And if so, where are you on those issues?
Well, I am very much for criminal justice reform when it's done in the right way, in a way that prioritizes public safety and actually helps offenders to turn their lives around. What I'm against is criminal justice reform, quote unquote, done in a haphazard fashion that simply, is a matter of releasing people, as many people as possible, and lowering penalties wherever possible, without regard to the actual impact that it has. So I don't, I can't give you like a full discourse on every issue you just mentioned without kind of delving into the specifics of them. But to take the sheriff example, that was the whole idea there, was that sheriffs had been sort of the most outspoken critics of what the governor was doing with respect to COVID. And so this was just political payback. That was exactly what that bill was. There's no reason that we need to have quote unquote oversight boards established on the part of one elected official in a county in order to oversee another elected official in the county. But on the broader issue, you can look at what's happened in California with, let's say, Prop 47, to take one example. This is billed as a big criminal justice reform bill, and the consequence of it is, of course, a huge spike in retail theft, which Gavin Newsom has now finally, become aware of with his big press conference a few weeks ago. But let's look at the other side of it when it comes to drug use. Not only has this created open drug use on streets throughout California, but it's also eviscerated the drug court system for the simple reason that prosecutors no longer have any leverage to induce offenders to enroll in drug treatment. And so it's a total lose-lose policy where we have more open drug use on our streets. We compromise public safety because there's a lot of ill effects associated with that, and we also don't give offenders the tools they need to turn their lives around. So I've been actually, I've worked on criminal justice reform issues in the legislature. I authored a police reform bill my second year in the legislature that brought together law enforcement and the ACLU in order to provide more transparency in officer-involved shooting cases. If you followed the Breonna Taylor case, after the grand jury declined to issue an indictment there, the family was like, well, we want to see the transcript. We want to know what happened in this grand jury proceeding. If that had happened in California, they would have a right to that transcript because of the bill that I authored that passed the legislature. So I am, not someone at all who believes that the solution is always putting in people in prison for as long as possible. But criminal justice reform needs to be done in a smart way, and it hasn't been done that way here.
So what would you do differently as governor, is there anything you would do sort of day one to address any of the issues that you just mentioned that you felt like the governor, didn't do a good job of doing?
Well, yeah, there's a lot that I do. I mean, he just recently made tens of thousands of offenders, violent offenders, eligible for earlier release, and that was done simply through an act of executive authority. And so I would release that. I think that's, kind of needs to be the first thing, is we need to make sure that truly dangerous offenders are not led into our communities before they're ready. And I think we need to, really think a lot harder about effective rehabilitation in California. We used to have a lot of programs that did a better job of sort of giving people, the sort of treatment or training that they need to successfully reintegrate into society. And so I want to work on, reviving those sort of programs.
Speaking of that, the governor issued a moratorium on the death penalty. Would you continue that, or would you reinstate executions if you were elected?
Well, I don't know that that's the correct way to phrase it, because the voters themselves, in 2016, I want to say, affirmed this as a tool that would continue to be available to prosecutors. And Gavin Newsom himself, in his 2018 campaign, said that he was going to respect the will of voters on this issue. Jerry Brown was also opposed to the death penalty, but he didn't believe that he had the power as governor to reverse it, especially with a voter initiative going the other way. And so I would do what Gavin Newsom said he was going to do when he campaigned. I would respect the will of voters.
Okay. The other question I have for you is, if you're elected for governor, you get a lot of, you'll have the authority to nominate people for the bench. Mm-hmm. Who's on your short list for the Supreme Court?
Oh, man.
Do you have names?
I don't have names. That'd be kind of a fun exercise, though, if I could come up with a list. I mean, I would, of course I could think of names off the top of my head, but I'm not going to throw them out there. I would want to appoint justices and judges throughout the judiciary who, would uphold the rule of law and who would uphold the Constitution. And I think that is more important than ever when you look at what just happened with my case with James Gallagher. We had a victory in the Superior Court, very thoughtful opinion by a judge there that, came to the proper conclusion that a state of emergency does not give a governor the power to create new law unilaterally. That is something that no law could do because our Constitution expressly prohibits it. And that was the conclusion that was reached by the Superior Court. So then the governor takes this case to his favored forum, the Third District Court of Appeals, which is, I would say, is the district that veers farthest from the judicial philosophy that I just articulated. Gets a panel of 3 justices who have, all worked for governors specifically, so have a certain outlook on things, and produce a really not very thoughtful at all opinion. And I'll get to my point here. Sorry, that actually sided with us on all of the legal issues, most of the legal issues, but somehow managed to, side with the governor on the overall question. But then the California Supreme Court, and this is just astounding to me, decided they're not, even though this is a very poorly done opinion, that they're not even going to review the case. If you look at other states where, there have been challenges to governors' emergency powers, they've come down different ways, but it's been the state's highest court that has decided the issue, the state Supreme Court. Here, our Supreme Court just said, we're not even going to deal with it.
So what top 3, how would your appointees be different? What qualities would you look for that are different from what Newsom would is looking for?
Well, I don't know exactly what he looks for when he appoints justices. And to be fair, I don't think any of the justices on the court that heard our case were his own appointees. I believe that one of the justices on the state Supreme Court is, and something like 4 of them are Jerry Brown's appointees. So I would look for justices that respect the Constitution and see their role as to set the parameters for our politics, to uphold the rule of law, to uphold the Constitution, to uphold the individual rights that cannot be violated even by by acts of democratic policymaking, but to otherwise allow for politics to play itself out within those parameters. And so here, in this case, you had our representative system of government entirely collapsing, and we needed the judicial branch to say, no, it's the right of the people to still have this process, to have a representative government. And our court system was completely derelict in that.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Thank you, Beronda. Now we have a very important issue for California, housing. And I'm going to turn it to Manuela Tobias, our housing reporter.
Hi, Assemblymember. Thank you for your time. You mentioned housing and homelessness a couple times already, so I'm excited to hear your thoughts on this. To get us started, what would you do differently than what Governor Gavin Newsom did during the pandemic and is doing now to reduce homelessness? And do you think that the $12 billion in the budget is too much or too little?
Well, I think it's not going to make a difference. And we have thrown more and more money at homelessness spending, homelessness with no positive impact. In fact, the problems continued to get worse, and this was utterly predictable. The LAO, nonpartisan legislative analyst, has said more funding will quickly dissipate because there's no strategy. In March of this year, the governor's own mental health advisor gave an interview, his mental health czar, where he repeatedly said that homelessness is not a money problem, it's a leadership problem. And he even specified it's a problem of leadership at the state level. I, for one, asked for an audit of all homelessness spending in California, which the governor administration pressured assembly members into not approving. It failed to get approved by a single vote. And then he vetoed Jesse Gabriel's bill that would have provided a more modest measure of accountability. I was a co-author of that bill, and it passed the legislature unanimously, and Gavin Newsom vetoed it. So I don't think, we now have an unsheltered homelessness population that's 9 times larger than the next closest state. And the governor's sort of new approach of throwing people in hotel rooms, there's no evidence that that works. If you simply provide that kind of accommodation, absent any sort of progress in terms of, the kind of interventions that have been shown on the basis of evidence to be helpful in permanently transitioning people out of homelessness. So in brief, my approach would be very different. I'd look to the limitations of the Ninth Circuit's decision, which says that you cannot ask people to kind of move along unless there is a place for them to go. So I'd prioritize having some shelter available in every community or in every region of the state. And then, once folks are there, you need to connect them with the needed services, whether that's drug treatment, abuse treatment, maybe whether it's mental health counseling. And then maybe, that you can have incentives where if they successfully complete, let's say, drug treatment, then, maybe you get an upgrade in your accommodations. That's the kind of approach that has been shown to work. I mean, this isn't brain surgery. Other states are not having the problem like we are. And so we can look at what's worked elsewhere, and we can do the same thing here.
So can you be a little bit more specific in how you would address the issue differently? Because shelters already exist. Some of these sort of triaging services is already happening across the state, and we're still not really seeing a dent made in that. Can you be a little more specific? And then you mentioned sort of that moving up when somebody receives treatment. Are you talking about sort of a treatment first approach as opposed to housing first? And can you elaborate a little bit more on that, on the specific differences between what Newsom has done and what you're proposing?
Sure, and the sort of triaging and shelters you're talking about don't exist on nearly the scale they need to, and you can look to the governor's own mental health czar's comments in that interview in March as evidence of that. And let's see, you then said in terms, so shelter first versus treatment first. I mean, the idea is that you need to have a roof over someone's head. That's what will allow you to get them off the street. We cannot have people living and dying and languishing on our streets. You have over 1,000 people dying every year on the streets of Los Angeles. We can't have that. And so if there's some roof that they can have over their head, then you have the legal authority to get them off the streets. That's the first thing. And once they have the roof over their head, then you connect them to the services.
Mm-hmm. And you've spoken at length, and you just mentioned sort of this accountability and audit. How exactly would you ensure, and what has not been done that you would do to ensure that homelessness dollars are spent effectively?
Well, I just want to know where they're going because we don't know much about that. And I can send you my audit request, which is extremely detailed in terms of we want to know where these dollars are going and what are the outcomes that we're getting. Is this even being measured? So we throw millions and millions of dollars at this program, millions of dollars at that program. Do we even know if it's making a difference at all? So the entire approach I was asking for is let's look at where the money's going. Let's look at what the outcomes are. Let's see what's working, and we can do more of that. And we'll see what's not working, and we can do less of it. And of course, allow for the local flexibility that's needed in different regions of the state that serve different populations. There was actually, a very minor audit approved. I think it was Rob Rivas who was the one who proposed it. That only looked at a small slice of of spending within the continuum of care program. And even that showed huge problems, even though that was only looking at a small slice of the overall pie. I mean, that's like step one. We should just look at, we're throwing all this money at it. Like, where is the money going? There was a poll done by the Schwarzenegger Institute at the beginning of 2020, I think it was, showing that 89% of California voters supported my audit. Which, try getting 89% of people to agree on anything these days. And so before we throw more and more money, $12 billion more this year at the problem, which even the governor's own top advisor says isn't going to help, which even the LAO says isn't going to help, shouldn't we look at what's happening with the money that's already there?
Right. And then to dive into housing, city and county governments, as well as neighborhood groups, have proven to be some of the most powerful adversaries when it comes to incentivizing housing production, whether it's opposing affordable housing or blocking sort of wholesale changes to zoning reform. Do you believe that these changes should be made at the state level? And if so, how would you plan to appeal to these very powerful and very different local opponents of change? And if not, how do you believe that the state should reach its housing goals?
Well, I think that the problems are primarily at the state level. I think that zoning reform is perhaps one part of the, of the puzzle, but is probably not the primary issue. And there is a balance that needs to be struck so that you're protecting the rights of individual property holders while also allowing for the local autonomy and flexibility to preserve the character of communities and allow for different types of communities to flourish throughout the state. I think when you look at the overarching problems with housing production in California, you have delays and fees and costs here that don't exist in any other state, really. I mean, you have, if you want to build in Nevada, the impact fees or the permitting fees here are 3 to 5 times higher than they are in Nevada, and they're twice as high as they are in any other state. You have all of these other fees that can make it I think it's like $150,000 before you even break ground on a project, and you can have approvals here that take years and years, that take weeks in other states. And this governor has done nothing about it. And you might say, well, what is he supposed to do? Well, he's the one who promised that he'd have millions more units, and he's delivered 1/5 of that. And new permits issued has actually declined while he's been governor. And so, this is another example of how there are solutions that are pretty easy to put your finger on. Go ahead.
So what exactly would you do differently? How would you slash those fees, for example? He has made this sort of a priority and has, come across these barriers time and again. So how would you be able to surmount those in a way he hasn't?
I mean, has he tried? I haven't seen a lot done in terms of actually, trying to move this issue forward. I mean, if you're asking me like, what exactly is legislation to across the board reduce fees going to look like? I don't think that's the way that I would approach it. I would say we absolutely need to reduce fees, and maybe you could provide a benchmark. We need to lower the cost of the initial that 150,000. We need to cut that in half, whatever the number might be, and the legislature needs to work on doing that. And I'd try to apply whatever pressure I could in order to move that along. But I would not, just simply release a full battery of changes, each and every one of which are non-negotiable. And the same goes for reducing the permitting time. And then as CEQA reform is also, of course, a huge part of the problem.
Right. So what steps would you take specifically to make sure that these policy proposals actually get through? What negotiating tools would you be willing to use to sort of make sure that housing agenda actually is prioritized?
Well, I'd go back to the answer I gave at the beginning, which is that, you need to have political accountability. That's the problem, is there's been no accountability for failed policymaking and for the continued decline of California as a state. I think that one of the issues is that people see that the quality of life is declining here. I mean, that is abundantly clear. You have 2/3 of people say that kids growing up in California today are going to be worse off than their parents. You have one survey showed 53% of Californians are looking to leave the state. Of course, last year we had the first population decline in state history. And so people see the problems all around them. I think that, because of all the noise in politics these days, there hasn't been the ability to sometimes to connect the dots to the failures at our state capitol. And in any given election, that sort of form of political accountability is hard to get because the races for the legislature are not particularly high profile, and there's a million other things on the ballot. There's presidential race, whatever. There's Congress, there's Senate, there's local races, there's initiatives, and so I actually think that the recall right now is a really unique opportunity to have a discussion as a state, a focused conversation as a state about specifically our state government and our state's future. And I think that if the recall is successful, that'll provide a mandate for change. And if the legislature then kind of frustrates the will of what the people of California have demanded, then that'll set up an opportunity to have another election in 2022. But I think that's the new element that is being brought to the equation here is political pressure and political accountability.
Thanks, Manuela. Before we're at the bottom of our hour or at the top of our hour, I wanted to see if we could have time for at least one more question. Emily has one, I know that. So Emily?
Hey, thanks for taking the time, Assembly member. Just to hopefully wrap things up, you've said repeatedly that Gavin Newsom is your only real opponent in this race. And I'm wondering what you would say to voters to convince them to vote for you, rather than other candidates running, especially the front runner, Larry Elder. And tagged onto that, I'm wondering if you could talk about if you agree with the critiques that Kevin Falconer made yesterday against Larry Elder, calling his comments and policies indefensible and sexist. So if you could answer that two-pronged question, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. So, my number one goal is for the recall to be successful. And that's why this is different than an ordinary election. There are two questions on the ballot. The first of which is, do you want to remove Gavin Newsom from office? And none of us on the second question will be the new governor unless that first question succeeds. And so I do not think it's productive to draw contrasts with other replacement candidates. My focus is entirely on drawing contrasts with Gavin Newsom. And as far as your question, well, how do voters then differentiate you from the other candidates? Well, I think that, it's whoever manages to draw that contrast best, whoever shows that they would sort of do the opposite of what Gavin Newsom has done and would be prepared to get the state on a new course, from day one in the most effective way. I think that's the person that, voters will ultimately choose to institute the fundamental call for change that a recall will represent. And I've been in the legislature for 5 years, as we've been talking about. I know exactly how corrupt our state capitol is. I know exactly how broken our state government is. And I think I'd be prepared on the first day in office to begin to do that, to translate, to answer the call for change that the recall represents with real, meaningful, major, tangible reforms at the Capitol and a new direction for the state, so that by the time 2022 comes around, voters will have a very clear choice. Do we want to continue on this new path, or do we want to go back to the way things were?
And on Larry Elder, do you agree with the former San Diego mayor's comments?
I don't really even know what he was referring to. I had never heard those comments before, so I'm not really in a position to comment.
Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I want to be respectful of your time. If you've got we've covered all of our topics. If you have a couple more minutes, I would just open it up to our reporters, but I'm also respectful of your time if you have to go.
No, that's fine.
Great, thank you. So we'll just open it up. Anybody who has a question.
So, Assemblymember, we did want to run one thing by you. Orrin Heatley, one of your who encouraged you to get in the race and who was one of the lead organizers of the recall, has made comments in the past about microchipping illegal immigrants. Do you disavow what he said, and what are your views on illegal immigration?
I'm not familiar with exactly what he said. I've heard Gavin Newsom use this as a talking point. I believe Orrin has said that he regrets that, and it does not reflect his views. And my views on illegal immigration are that, it's a significant issue right now, what's happening at the border. And a lot of what we've done in California has been extremely unhelpful towards that. On the other hand, we need to, legal immigration is an important part of our national character. And so I would, be a big supporter of that, especially in terms of recruiting folks who can help us compete in the global economy.
Thanks. I have a quick question. Or go.
No, you go ahead, Dave.
So would you do anything to change the rules for recalls in California?
I'll tell you this, I'd say that we should have a set of rules that, is fairly stable. And if there are going to be changes, it shouldn't be done in the middle of a recall, which is what the practice has been. In 2017, they decided, well, we're going to try to save Josh Newman by stretching out this recall process. And then, of course, that was the law that was in effect here. So we're all planning for a November recall. And then Gavin Newsom and Steve Glazer, who's kind of the person engineering all of this, says, well, actually, we think November wouldn't be his best chance to win. We think we move it up a couple months, then he's got a better chance to win, because who knows, there'll be fires, there'll be issues, schools reopen, there'll be COVID stuff. And so they actually changed the law for the recall in the middle of the election, like a month ago, whenever was he signed that bill, in order to change the laws for recalls in the middle of a recall for the express purpose of giving himself a better chance of winning. If you look at like international election monitoring groups like Jimmy Carter's foundation, like the United Nations, one of the things they specifically cite as the sign of like a banana republic is when you have the, those in power actually change the rules for an election in the middle of an election. And so, certainly the way the recall process exists now is not perfect, because it's been completely manipulated through changes to laws over the last few years. But I think that the recall process as a mechanism is a really important one that provides, a measure of accountability to our state's budget. It's been used infrequently, not a lot, but it is sort of a last remaining recourse for voters to take matters into their own hands.
Do you think it's should be more difficult to qualify, or do you have any questions about a situation where it's plausible, where the incumbent being recalled has more of the vote than the successor in a recall?
Well, I'm not sure we need to change the qualification requirements, because this has been around since 1913, and it's not been used all that much. I mean, it's been used fairly infrequently. So I don't know why there's a need to, suddenly create new barriers, other than, that the politicians who are losing their jobs don't like that. I think that if anything, we need to have more opportunities for the people of California to engage in our process, not fewer. Now, in terms of the scenario that you present, that is not exactly how it would play out, because the idea of a recall is that this person is no longer fit for office, full stop. He has abused the public trust, and he needs to go. It's a yes or no question. It's a binary set of outcomes. And the question of who will be the successor, that is separate and apart from the first question of, is this person fit to be in office? So if a majority of voters say that Gavin Newsom is no longer fit to be our governor, then that is exercising the power of the recall in the manner in which it's designed. And it's not that unusual. You have votes of no confidence, for example, that are a mechanism in parliamentary modes of government, where it's a simple majority that says, as a yes or no matter, does this person, are they fit to remain a minister? And you don't say, well, gosh, but if they get more than people would support whatever given successor is there, then it's not a vote of no confidence. This is a vote of no confidence by the people of California. The successor is a separate question.
Good. Ben, did you have a question?
Oh, sure. Yeah. If we have time, I apologies, because this is kind of a job interview type question, but I am curious if there is if there is a particular issue that you've changed your mind about politically, and if you could just talk about that process.
Oh, interesting. So one issue where I did change was the school start times bill, which I opposed the first couple times it came through, and I ultimately supported the third time. I was actually the deciding vote on that in the Education Committee in 2019, I want to say. My view of education is generally that we should empower local districts and school leaders with the flexibility to run their schools as they see fit, and that, that there should be then accountability for learning outcomes. But we shouldn't be regulating too much on the, the inputs in terms of what they're required to do. Of course, the way our system works now, it's pretty much the opposite. So that was why I had initially opposed that bill, which would have, which does for, I think it's middle school and high school, say you can't start any earlier than 8:30. I was persuaded, even when I voted against it, that sort of the, the brain science and all the research that show that there's big benefits to delaying school start. I certainly would have liked it when I was a kid if we had started later. But I thought that, this should be in the hands of districts. What ultimately, persuaded me is that I had talked to a lot of superintendents, school leaders who said that they actually wanted to change their start time, but they couldn't do it because other districts in their region started earlier. And if they moved, on their own, then they'd be out of sync with surrounding districts. And, that makes it so you can't do extracurriculars. It messes with your bus schedules and that sort of thing. So I came to view it as like a collective action problem, and that we could actually sort of, empower local districts to make the decisions they wanted to make if we simply kind of change the default at the state level.
Great, thank you.
Good. Any other questions, anybody? Well, good. Assemblyman, thank you very much for your time. This has been a great discussion. We've covered a lot of ground. And like I said, we will post this to our voter guide and encourage people to vote on September 14th. And
awesome. And thank you for the work you guys do. I think that CalMatters has really been a great, a real force for good in the world of California politics. So thank you.
All right. Take care.
To learn more about the recall election and more on candidates' views, check out our recall voter guide on calmatters.org.